Okay, I think we are ready to go. My name is Ben Gilson, an associate at Arup, and I'll be chairing this webinar. So before we start, I just wanted to start with a few housekeeping points. So I'll just skip to the next slide. How it's going to work. So firstly, to let you know, if you have any challenges or issues, if you raise your hand, and one of the Syria members can get in touch to help you with that. Secondly, we're going to have a Q&A session. There'll be plenty of time for that at the end so we can hear your questions and pose them to the panelists. So during the sessions, do type your questions into the Q&A box, and you can state if you wish your questions to be directed to one or other of the speakers, and we'll monitor those as they come in. And you can use the thumbs up icon there to vote for the questions, and that'll help us to prioritize the most popular questions and make sure we get to those ones. So please do use that. We're keen to hear about your experiences of the webinar. So do let us know at the end of the experience, and that'll also give you the CPD for the event as well. And finally, to let you know, there's the chat function there as well that can be accessed during the webinar. And at the end, please share your views with us at using the hashtag AI in construction and at Syria to share on LinkedIn and X, etc. We're going to wrap up at about 12:30, so we've got a good session to get to. So let's start firstly with a bit about Syria. So for those of you who might not be aware, so Syria is a non-for-profit organisation, and sorry, I've just pressed the wrong button there. It recently celebrated its 60th anniversary as a non-for-profit organisation. One of the core strengths has always been improving performance through collaboration in the built environment and the construction sectors. And they do this by delivering independent guides like the SUBS manual, the ROC manual, the International Levy Handbook, asbestos and biodiversity net gain. And as most attendees will know, Syria have a particularly strong legacy in asset management and the geotechnical guides, including the embedded retaining walls, hidden defects in bridges, structural health monitoring, INSAR, the Earth observation techniques, and geotechnical baseline reports. And in 2023, the Good Practice Guide to using geophysics in ground investigation. Syria organise around 30 events a year, structured webinars like this, mostly online at the moment, ranging from topical conferences, annual debates and lectures, to webinars and the guidance, such as today's topic. The membership is small but growing, so around about 80 members you can see on the slide here. Many of you here joining us today, which is great. Okay, so we are going to talk today about reasonable skill and care using AI in construction. So I'm going to kick off and introduce the session first to give a bit of an overview and get us all up to speed before we then hand over to the rest of the speakers and panelists. Because what brings us today, the adoption of AI technology in construction is at an early stage, and it varies across the industry, as we know. Yet it'll be increasingly integrated into different business processes. Despite the benefits, AI does come with risk. It's typically a contractual requirement for contractors and consultants to exercise reasonable skill and care when providing their services. And this duty is fulfilled by acting in accordance with industry good practice and professional standards. And its industry guidance isn't necessarily well established for using AI in construction, and technology races ahead of guidance at times and ahead of legal precedent, for example. Questions will arise about what standard of care is required when using AI and generative AI within construction, or how to evidence that reasonable skill and care has been used. So this webinar aims to bring together legal experts. We're going to hear from James and Peter later on as our panelists for this discussion around reasonable and care and the legal aspects of using AI within construction. And we're delighted to be joined by Peter and James, who I'll be introducing shortly. So to start with and just set the scene about it, make sure we're all on the same page here, I've got a few slides of context at the beginning. So what do we mean by artificial intelligence? There's a useful definition here on the screen, defining the sort of overall umbrella, looking at AI as a system, a machine-based system that infers from input that it receives how to generate outputs. And there's a bit more context there around it. And this is a definition used by the UK government in the guidance that they provide as well. So then if we look at some of the components within artificial intelligence, within that umbrella, many of you be familiar with machine learning. So this is looking at a machine or a model learning from data that's been provided to it, and using statistical analysis and models to then predict or infer future predictions to when it then gets other input data. So an example here might be taking multiple input data from a ground investigation testing method and using that, the different data sets that come in from one test type to infer soil layers. That might be an example of machine learning. And then as we increase the complexity and the level of statistical depth and different layers, which are referred to as neurons and neural networks, we then look at deep learning. And in this example, one case study might be here, or use case, looking at artificial intelligence to recognize objects from photographs. The example on the slide here being recognizing defects from a tunnel photographs that have been taken as part of a condition survey. And then within that umbrella, we have the concept of generative AI, so using artificial to generate information, text, images, music, whatever that might be, using large language models that are following the same principles that we just talked through, but with increasing layers of complexity and levels of training data. And it's useful perhaps to think of them as a kind of virtual librarian that has access to this huge wealth of information that's been trained on, that is then taking an input prompt from a user, accessing that wealth of information and reporting back a response. So where are we within construction? I think it's useful to look at a recent survey published from September this year from the RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, from their survey looking at the uptake of AI within construction. And we can see across different components of construction here, around 2/3 of the respondents suggested they thought there was moderate to high significance of AI influencing the different components of the construction aspects. And we know that UK government has this significant fund announced in the recent budget to seize the opportunity of digital technology and AI. But yet we don't see that uptake yet. So that same survey by RICS indicated that around 2 in 10 people yet hadn't seen the regular or frequent use, widespread use of AI in their projects. So with most people still at either early stage pilots or no implementation yet. So we can see that we're likely to see a growth of AI used across the industry. So one of the key considerations and aspects that we're thinking about today is around capability. So in this one example, to show what AI potentially purports to be capable of, if I've given it a prompt here showing a sketch of a foundation for a building with a brief description of a soil type and an instruction to calculate the capacity of a foundation, and I just send that image in, and the large language model produces an output, which one might look at it and think that seems well reasoned, thought through, it's referencing codes. And then when you look more closely, we see that yes, a lot of that is correct and it's found the right equations to use, but actually there are some errors within that and some inaccuracies. So one of the major challenges we have is to look at the use cases. Even though AI will give you an answer on something like that, how do we then use reasonable skill and care to decide what is the right AI methodology or model to use, and how much ownership, responsibility would the AI have to produce that answer, and how do we still ensure we have reasonable skill and care and that standard of care when assessing the outputs? Because we do see big issues around challenges and accuracy. We've seen recently, they're highlighted in the news, reports with errors within them that has been, had to be redone or taken off from projects and to refunds given. So there've been issues with using AI that hasn't been checked fully, perhaps. I've had conversations with AI. You can see in the middle there, trying to convince them that 9.1 is smaller than 9.9 because they get mixed up with decimal places. And even underneath the hood, not so obvious, the models that are being trained, you can get issues with underfitting. So the model it doesn't fit the data well. and therefore wouldn't be able to predict well, or overfitting, where it's been sort of overly trained and therefore is too reliant on the training data and can't be used to predict or extrapolate ongoing. So when we're looking at how far AI can take the responsibility from us and then the increased liability that comes, we might have, for example, just helping us find information, so accelerating human process at one end of the scale. It might be then operating software, so operating within guardrails. So again, we've got a lot of control over what it's doing, but we might be then asking it to perform the analysis, but follow an approach. So again, there's less guardrails, but still some guardrails around it. Or as we've seen in that previous example, it might then be selecting the calculation approach or the assessment approach and running with it. So at each stage, we're losing potentially control unless we make sure we have these guardrails in to exercise reasonable skill and care at each stage. So that was just a bit of an introduction to hopefully get us all on the same page, the same understanding of where we're heading. So we're going to be looking at these topics around the standard of care using AI, levels of due diligence, is it reasonable to avoid AI, an interesting question, and the 5 pathways to liability. So with that, I've given you a bit of an introduction. Peter, I'm going to hand over to you in a moment to talk through discharging a duty of care when using generative AI. Then we're going to follow on with James talking us through the 5 pathways to liability. We've got a panel discussion to follow that between the 3 of us, so I can ask them some questions, and then we'll get on to your questions after that before the closing remarks. So a huge welcome to our speakers, and thank you for joining us today. We have Peter Stockwell here, a partner from Pennington's Manchester Cooper, and I think without further ado, I shall now hand over to Peter, who's going to discuss with us discharging a duty of care when using generative AI. Peter, welcome. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for that really excellent introduction to the topic, because AI is a huge topic, isn't it? As AI seeks to simulate what our own brains can do, it follows that it can do as many things as we can imagine. And so just being clear about what we're talking about, what type of AI we're talking about is really, really instructive. I'm just going to say for 10 minutes or so a few things about discharging a duty of care when you're using AI, and in particular generative AI technologies in the performance of your services. Now, on any occasion when we look to the future, when we look to new developments and think about what's likely to happen, it's always helpful, isn't it, to think about what's not going to change, to get a bit of certainty around that. What I would suggest is not going to change in this area is the law in relation to negligence claims. The legal principles around duties of care will be applied to new practices and new technologies, and the courts will, as they already do, apply a standard of care to professionals performing their services, whether or not they use AI technologies. The standard of care is expressed usually as being the standard of a reasonably competent member of the same profession in the same circumstances. That allows for a range of different approaches. It allows for novel approaches. It allows for unusual approaches, assuming always that there's a rational basis for the approach that's being taken. It's not sufficient that other people would have done the same thing if there isn't a rational basis for that behavior. So it's the standard of care that we're thinking about. 3 things I would say to think about on that front. Firstly, it's really very unlikely that AI will reduce the standard of care that is expected. The buck will still stop with the professional to discharge their duty. Indeed, generative AI, like other technologies and other advancements in information and understanding, is only really likely to increase the standard of care that's expected, because of course it will make it possible to do things more efficiently. It will make it possible to do things more effectively, particularly when engaging with large amounts of data that needs to be analysed, when optioneering, when checking, etc. So it shouldn't be thought that this is a change that will reduce what's expected of professionals. Far from it, I would suggest. The second thing I would say about the standard of care is that a professional can themselves increase the standard of care expected of them by what they say to their clients, particularly in the lead up to and in their contract. if they hold themselves out as being a specialist in a particular AI technology, if they extol the virtues of a particular AI tool that they have developed, then a court is likely to take the view that their client is entitled to expect what they were told to expect. So in that sense, the standard of care could be elevated. And the third thing to say is that the case law over the decade shows us that when a professional is engaging at the state of the art, when they're using new technology, when there's known uncertainty, that there is an extra layer of prudence, an extra layer of care required, both in the performance of the task and in the advice around that that's given to the client. So one can expect the standard of care to be pushed upwards in that way as well. Then when it comes to assessing a professional's performance, so considering whether they have met that standard, where a professional has used an AI technology, because the way in which they have in fact gone about performing their services will have been different, it follows that the things that the court might look at in considering whether they've discharged their duty might be different. And in this context, what that means is that there's going to be scrutiny around the selection, the adoption, as well as the use of AI technologies. And so the kinds of questions that might be asked are, well, has the tool that was used been used for similar projects in the past? Has it demonstrably produced appropriate results? Was the data set on which the tool was trained appropriate for the exercise that's been undertaken? Was any information that was input into it, any assumptions that were set, if relevant, any prompts that were used, appropriate for the task that was being carried out? Were the professionals that were using it sufficiently trained to understand its limitations, its constraints, its biases, etc.? How did they verify the design that was produced by it? To the extent that it was producing alternative options, how did they review those, check that nothing had gone awry with the assumptions that were set at the beginning? How did they consider those various options? And more generally, what was the human-led intervention and oversight throughout the process? Was there an appropriate level of supervision, not just by the individual engineer, for example, but also by other people, other more senior individuals in the organization? Remembering that decision-making is invariably a context-specific undertaking, and that an AI technology will not necessarily have the capacity to understand context in the way that a human would do. And so it is that when you look back over the last 40 or 50 years to the history of sort of significant failures involving software, and I'm thinking of matters in the medical technology sphere, in aviation, in space exploration, what you see in the inquiries that followed was particular scrutiny around the validation and the testing of technology and around the checking of the outputs from that technology. In a sense, much more so than the basic question of, well, what actually went wrong within the programming or whatever. So it's that extra layer of care that I would suggest will be the difference in considering the performance of a professional against their standard. That extra layer of care, one step removed from the direct performance of the task in question, around the selection and the adoption of AI technologies. Now, there is as yet no universally accepted standard for selecting and adopting or indeed using AI technology. Ben helpfully showed you on his slides the front covers of the UK government's playbook on using AI, which has a helpful set of 10 principles to be considered when engaging with AI. He also showed you the slightly more recent, from September this year, guidance note on the responsible use of AI produced by the RICS for surveyors, which I would suggest is a really useful document to have a look at. Because of the breadth of the surveying profession, there's lots in there that we can take and think about in the context of our own practices. And I'm just going to say for a couple of minutes, give you an introduction for a couple of minutes on the sort of thing that engages with. It's helpful, I would suggest, to think of it as talking about things at three levels. At the level of practice management, what you do within your business. At the level of project management, what tools you choose to adopt for a particular project or task. And at the level of use of adopted tools as well. And so under those three headings, at the level of practice management, the guide talks about data governance. It talks about the training and the technological barriers to ensure the confidentiality of information put into a model is preserved, ensuring people understand the difference between open and closed AI models. Systems governance, selection of tools that are appropriate for use within the business and for what they can be used and under what circumstances. And risk management procedures, considering bias inherent in AI systems, erroneous outputs, data limitations, data retention as well. And then an ongoing review of all of those things across the business. It then moves on to talking about project management at the level of your project or task. What's the due diligence required around the selection and the procurement of a particular tool? What questions ought to be asked to the supplier about the data on which it's trained, how it will operate, how to get the best out of it. And for the purpose of that project or task, what training is required for users? How do you ensure they understand what the AI is doing, what its limitations are, the confidentiality implications of any information that's input into it, the importance of checking its outputs. And then when finally we get onto the notion of engaging with the technology, the guide talks about care over inputs and review of outputs, bearing in mind that review of outputs means something very different depending upon what you're doing. If it's a large or a one-off task, a certain degree of oversight and checking is possible. If you're using AI technology in the context of a volume activity when it's producing large amounts of output, what's the appropriate degree of care there? What level of sampling and checking and at what intervals is appropriate in that sort of context? Remembering always that you may never be able to explain why the AI produced the output that it did. And so understanding the way in which it was chosen and set up and adopted and checked is doubly important. And then, as always, in the context of any matter of defensibility or litigation, records are key. And so all of these things at the practice management, at the project, and at the use level all need to be documented in a way that makes the exercise of care demonstrable. So just drawing the threads together on all of that, I would suggest 3 takeaways in relation to this question of discharging duties of care when using AI. But firstly, the standard of care is unlikely to go down. It's really very likely that it will creep up over time because of the availability of technologies. Secondly, litigation claims will invariably focus on the selection and adoption as well as the use of AI. And so one needs to step back from the coalface and think about how care has been taken in that way. And thirdly, advice. Advice is often important in a defensibility context, just as you would in giving any advice where you're proceeding based on limited information, for example, or pending change. You ought properly to explain the basis for your advice and qualify it appropriately, so the client has been informed as to the level of reliability of that advice and how it might change. So I'll pause there in terms of my remarks pending the open discussion in a little while. Before I do, I'm just going to introduce to you a little poll. We're going to do one now, and we're going to do one after James's talk, and then we'll feed back the responses in our open session and see where people came out. So you should see on your screen now a couple of questions that you can answer, and then we'll come back and look at the results in a little while. Thank you so much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Peter. And just a reminder to please type in your questions for the speakers using the questions box so we can pick them up in the discussion shortly, and use the thumb voting buttons as well to introduce the priorities. So let's begin with our second presentation from James Hutchinson, a partner at Beale & Co, who will be presenting on the 5 pathways to liability, AI in the built environment.
Thank you very
James.
much, Ben, Peter, and good morning to everyone. So let's set the scene. A drone scans a construction site. It feeds images and information into an AI model that predicts some structural weaknesses on the site before they happen. It sounds a bit futuristic, but it's really happening now on sites. And AI promises speed, efficiency, and safety, yet every algorithm, every tool could potentially introduce some new legal risk. If we don't manage those risks, the liability costs and the damage they could cause could dwarf the efficiency gains that you're looking for. So today, what I'm going to try and do quite quickly is share kind of 5 pathways to liability, sort of 5 areas of concern and risk, and hopefully some practical steps to keep your use of this innovative technology safe. So the first one I'm really going to look at is data and privacy. So AI runs on data, and that makes privacy compliance really the first risk. Under the UK GDPR, the principles of lawfulness, fairness, and transparency apply in full. So if you're capturing biometrics, drone footage, or even images of neighboring properties, you really need to work out what's the basis you're doing that. What's the lawful basis? Usually it's things like consent or legitimate interests. It's vital that processing is conducted fairly, avoiding algorithmic bias, and you must be transparent. You really need to be able to explain your use of AI as much as possible, its logic, in plain English to people. And if your data processing is likely to create a high risk to individuals, and we're thinking things here like workplace surveillance, for example, would be a high risk to individuals, then you need to consider whether you need to do something like a data protection impact assessment. And regulators, we found, love these impact assessments because what they're demonstrating is board level due diligence. And if your team can't produce one or something similar after a significant data breach or some kind of incident, I'd expect quite a lot of criticism. And if we look at that, if you think about the fines, well, fines remain up to £17.5 million or 4% of global turnover, whichever is higher. But actually, I think the reputational damage can often hurt more. And think about here sort of recent cyber incidents that people have seen, major brands such as M&S or Jaguar Land Rover. Those kind of headlines can actually linger far longer than the fine that was imposed or may be imposed in relation to those 2 organizations. And don't forget international data transfers either. Suppliers of common data environments may replicate your data outside the UK or EU by default. You really need some standard contractual clauses, risk assessments, and looking at things like technical measures like encryption or deletion when data is no longer needed. So my practical tip here for data and privacy is, can you create some kind of AI data register? That should be a living inventory of each data set being used. You know, what's the lawful basis, retention period, security measures. You really want to try and embed, as I think Peter said before, you know, a human in the loop who's reviewing whenever AI makes decisions that actually affect people. And we see this in some recent cases. A Dutch tax authority was fined because of algorithmic bias, and a Belgian council was fined for drone inspections without a lawful basis. So really, the lesson here is collect only what you need. Can you explain it, and delete information when you don't need it anymore? Turning to intellectual property, well, construction projects are IP rich, as we know. You know, you've got drawings, BIM objects, parametric scripts, even the data sets themselves. And AI can complicate some old assumptions. First, you know, who owns the AI output? UK copyright law says the author is the person who makes the arrangements necessary for the creation. So if an architect is using a generative tool to produce design options and selects ones, they're likely the author of that design and the copyright. But if a subcontractor feeds that architect's design into an AI tool and presses generate or whatever the button is on the particular tool, ownership in the output might be less clear. So to avoid any surprises, what we really want to do is spell it out in the contract. Who owns the model? Who owns the outputs and actually the underlying data? And second, don't assume data sets online are free. There's ongoing litigation for Getty Images litigation against Stability AI, and it shows that web and online scraping of material that's freely available can breach copyright. So we want to make sure in our contracts as much as possible there is some information about training data provenance. What was the model trained on? And just something related to that, I just want to flag up is AI washing, which is where you can overstate AI capability. In the US, the SEC, a financial regulator, has fined firms for hyping AI they didn't have, and class actions are starting to emerge. In construction, marketing a platform as, say, AI-powered clash detection when it's some kind of rules-based or manual system could trigger a misrepresentation claim. So my advice here really is don't overhype AI use in your tender responses, RFPs, etc. Check your AI claims in any materials that you submit. And we've touched on contracts and risk allocation, but I wanted to flag how things like the standard form contracts that you see, and we see on a daily basis in construction, the JCTs, NECs, FIDIC contracts, that they've been written really for kind of a human-centric design. AI actually introduces some blind spots to those contracts. So first, if you've got a fitness for purpose type warranty, that will assume you've got control over the design. But if part of that design comes from some kind of opaque model licensed from a US software vendor, control really can become limited. So can you get your AI vendors to provide validation reports and confirm that they're maintaining models within safety tolerances? Second is indemnities can become more difficult. Consultants will often indemnify employers for if there is any IP infringement, so intellectual property infringement. But how do you know if your AI supplier's training data was fully licensed? If it wasn't, then you may be at risk of breaching that indemnity. So check whether your supplier provides you with an indemnity for breaches of its own intellectual property. Changes in law can also be a problem. This is a fast developing area. The EU AI Act, partway through a project, could reclassify your system as being high risk. That could trigger costly compliance issues. Is it possible to include a clause allowing renegotiation if regulations tighten? Unlikely for most areas of a contract. Maybe you'll be able to get one for AI. And watch out for hidden AI in software updates. So vendors are quietly enabling AI features in routine upgrades. Just look at Microsoft Office over the last couple of years. Copilot is creeping into Teams, Word, Outlook. How would you keep on top of that? Those features may be ingesting personal data or even generating new IP. How can you manage that? And fourth, safety and product liability. Well, we all know that construction is safety critical. And as Peter said, AI doesn't dilute those duties. It can actually highlight and heighten them. Under the Building Safety Act, the golden thread must capture all safety relevant data, including AI model architecture, training data, and override logs. I think if you lose them and there was a problem on site, you could risk criminal liability. Product liability is tightening as well for construction products. So the EU and the UK are considering strict liability for AI systems, meaning just defect plus damage could suffice and produce a claim. So, boards looking at these kind of issues should insist that there are human override protocols and preserving that telemetry. And we've all seen how AI can hallucinate. If anyone's ever used ChatGPT, it comes up with and invents things from time to time, and the courts are paying attention. So there was a UK case of Inde in the London Borough of Haringey from this year. 2 lawyers filed pleadings citing cases that they'd asked ChatGPT to summarize. Unfortunately, those cases were entirely fictional. In it, the court allowed the pleadings to be amended, but warned that professionals who rely on unverified AI outputs risk regulatory referral. So it's easy to imagine how a similar situation could arise in a safety critical situation. And then finally, just looking at some insurance and professional liability issues. Insurers in the sector are moving very fast. Some are now sending out AI governance questionnaires as part of renewals. They're asking things like, do you have an AI policy? Do you audit data provenance? Is there human oversight? I'm not saying that they're pricing on that basis, but they're just trying to get market data. And I think it's also important for you to have a look at your policies and see, are there any silent AI gaps? And these might exist in legacy professional indemnity policies and cyber policies. For example, exclusions for software failure could leave you exposed in professional services. So see if you can negotiate affirmative endorsements extending cover to AI-driven errors if they're not already included. Make sure you disclose AI fully if you're doing project-specific work. And remember, underwriters also care about supply chain governance. It's not just vertically with your clients. They're interested in what's going on with your supply chain. Back-to-back indemnities, due diligence, and audit rights do matter. So really just sort of summing up and pulling things together. Clearly, AI in construction is here to stay. The question isn't whether we use it, it's whether we govern it and use it well. So if I can set you a little challenge maybe before your next project, maybe a few questions that you can ask yourself. Do you know what data is being collected and why it's being collected? Have we checked whether AI is being used on the project? And that might be by us, our JV partners, or anyone in our supply chain. And have we locked down our contracts? You know, are we looking at things like safety protocols? Are we insured for the kind of work we're doing? If the answer to any is, well, not quite yet, well, I'd say that's something to think about and start today, because you should hopefully be able to reduce your risk and then enjoy all the benefits that AI has to offer. So thanks, everyone. Again, there's a couple of poll questions which hopefully will come up. And it'd be great if you could answer those, and then we'll pick those up a little bit later.
Fantastic, James. Thank you very much. So we'll give it a couple of minutes for people to fill in the polls. But I will ask now both of our panelists to turn back on their microphones and cameras, and we'll go through into the panel session first. Have a discussion around the poll results, which I'll just ask if they could be brought up, the first poll, and then we'll get on to your questions. So please do keep them coming into the Q&A part, because we look forward to hearing what you want to ask our experts. So let's see if we could see, please, the results from Peter's poll. Okay, I think everyone should be able to see that now on screen. So just to summarize there, so we're seeing the first question: will the use of generative AI increase or decrease construction costs? A few people think increase, most people think decrease. And then the second question applied to professional fees, and interesting, much closer there. So not as much of a gap with looking at fees, will they increase or decrease, but a slight margin thinking they decrease. I mean, Peter, turning back to you, what is that as expected? Any surprises that you're seeing there?
I think I agree with the body of our attendees on that. I think so far as construction costs are concerned, it's not obvious that, at least in the short term, the direct cost of physical construction will be substantially reduced by AI technology. But you can see that the indirect costs may well be, to the extent that indirect costs take the form of project administration, checking engineers, number of personnel. You can see clear potential for AI to produce savings in that area, and so reduce construction costs overall. And that doesn't seem a very long way off, and indeed I'm sure it's being realised to some extent already. So far as professional fees are concerned, because adoption of AI technologies in construction is necessarily a careful process because of the degree of risk involved, it isn't necessarily having a huge impact on what professionals, and in particular consulting professionals, are having to do at the moment. The technology is relatively nascent. And so I don't think people are yet feeling or necessarily clearly envisaging where the savings will come from. So I think it's spot on, that poll. I think the aspiration to decrease cost is there, but I don't think it's being realised just yet.
Yeah, thank you. And I think an interesting conversation that I know we're having in our organisation around the use of AI in fees is, whether people are using it to try and cut cost and cut corners, as we've seen in some examples, or whether we're using it to try and increase quality and actually give a better deliverable and output to clients. So I guess that mindset and approach also has implications on the standard of care we've been discussing today. James, do you have any comments on that or the polls?
Yeah, I think the polls were, as Peter said, I'm not surprised by the results there. I think also it's important to think about it's not just fees and quality, but also speed of response. So hopefully the use of AI will speed up developments and projects whilst maintaining the same level of quality. So you could potentially do more with less. Whether that's actually the reality in the end, we won't know. And I think what we'll see is some people launching ahead with the use of AI and then actually finding that physical constraints on sites, planning permission, delivery of items, actually humans working on the site will be the blockers. So actually you may get design done quicker, you may get other elements achieved quicker. Whether that actually results in the entire project length reducing is not quite clear at the moment, because you'll get some people really heavily using it and then others not. And so, yeah, that's an interesting element as well.
Yeah, thank you. Agreed. Great. Let's move on to the second poll, please. If we could have the responses to James's poll. Have a look at the areas of potential concern and whether or not people do have a policy in place. So we've got the 6 different areas there: data and privacy, intellectual property, contract risk, safety and liability. Yeah, interesting to see you all coming in relatively low there. The safety and product liability perhaps coming in higher there. I mean, does that reflect the sort of discussions you're having with clients in the industry at the moment, that seems to be the biggest concern, or most of your conversations around that area, James?
Yeah, and I think safety and product liability is a key risk here. I also think the kind of quality control within organizations is going to be very difficult. Knowing inside an organization who has used AI. So say if you've got a junior member of a team who's done some design work, them informing the more senior person that actually there was some AI input in it, because it wouldn't necessarily be clear from what they've done. So, someone doing some double checking of that. I think that is going to be fundamental, is, keeping that human in the loop, but the human knowing that AI has been involved somewhere to do the checking. I think that's very difficult. That is difficult. Looking at the kind of the second poll, look, great to see that we've got 50% effectively have already got a policy in place, whether it's informal or a formal policy. That's good to see. Another 22% are planning one. 28% have no plans yet. I think going forward, if you're going to be using AI in any way, whether that's Copilot through to more detailed AI tools and things like Autodesk or Forma and other tools, you do need some kind of policy in place, because otherwise it becomes a bit of the Wild West and everyone using ChatGPT on their phones or unsecured forms of AI.
Yeah. And Peter, your view on it, perhaps on the first list and the emphasis that's come out there. I mean, does that reflect where your concerns are most and your conversations have been with clients on this topic?
Yes, I think as professionals, we all concern ourselves with what we do on a day-to-day basis, and knowing that we are delivering to our clients in the right way. And so I think that's naturally where people's mind goes. and there's a sort of human element, isn't there, to interacting with the technology. It's extremely reassuring when someone or something tells us something that reinforces what we think, or that might give us an opinion before we've formed ours. But of course, the danger is that that's false comfort, particularly if we can't see the reasoning behind it. So there's a natural human element now, and that comes to the training piece when people are being trained on the importance of checking and how they might check, to just be mindful of that psychological danger of taking false comfort because someone or something has said the same thing that you were thinking. But equally, let's not forget that just because we as professionals are focused on what it is that we do for a living, that these other things, and in particular data and privacy, which James has absolutely rightly focused on, are hugely important in this context. And I think there's an extent to which there's an underappreciation of the risks there. It's very, very easy to breach confidentiality when using AI. So I think maybe that the importance of that is perhaps understated by this poll.
Yes, okay. Yes, very useful to see and respond to what the audience thinks. Thank you. Great. I think we will move on to the next stage then and start to take some questions from the audience to the panelists. So thank you those that have typed in questions so far. Please keep them coming, and we'll keep putting them to our panelists. So I think we've got one at the top that's got 6 votes so far. So we'll start with that, and I'll open it up to both of you. So to read the question: if the courts may scrutinise inputs to AI models, should generative AI prompts and returns be documented and archived as part of a project's documentation or the CDM health and safety file? Who would like to respond to that?
I can say something about that if that's helpful. I mean, let me just start with a slightly different question. Are interactions with AI tools going to be disclosable in legal proceedings? Absolutely. Of course they are, in the same way as all your other workings and your other outputs are. And so to the extent that you want those things to be available to demonstrate your diligence, then absolutely you ought to be thinking about data retention. To some extent, there'll be a degree of data retention within the tools that you're using, both on your systems and on the provider's systems. But if that is part of your document retention policy, if that is part of the way in which you're going to demonstrate that you've done your job properly, then you'll need to share or export those records, I would suggest, and to keep them somewhere. But interestingly, the question is also being considered by organisations the other way around. Do we actually want this data to be retained? Do we actually want these particularly informal interactions with ChatGPT or whatever it is to be making up their way onto our project records, potentially to be disclosed in litigation or not? Now, once you know a claim is coming, your data deletion policies need to be suspended anyway. But up until that point, the question some organisations are asking is, actually, do we want to keep this stuff around or not?
Yeah, thank you. And the thinking around the prompts, I mean, I know from experience and seeing it, the prompts when using generative AI can have such a huge impact on the response you get, the accuracy, whether or not you have hallucinations. So no matter what due diligence or training and quality goes into providing a tool, for generative AI, it's then so much down to the user and the prompt, isn't it? James, would you like to offer any comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's entirely correct. And you could imagine a claim arising and someone asking for information about the prompt, but not just the prompt that was used, but the documents that were uploaded. And you can imagine if there were 10 vital documents uploaded and actually only 9 of them were dragged across onto the system and 1 was left off, it would give the output could be completely wrong because it missed out a whole load of information. And that would be relevant to the claim. I do think if there was a significant health and safety, it's not my area of speciality, other colleagues are, but if there was a significant health and safety claim and AI had been used and you were not able to demonstrate not only the inputs, but the decisions that were made based on the outputs, I think you would potentially come in for criticism. But I pick up Peter's point that how much do you want to retain? The problem with, where, say, an engineer is doing some design work at the moment, their exact thought processes might not be documented, which might be beneficial in certain instances. With some of the enterprise AI tools, they have very granular, some of them, capturing of questions that were asked, the decisions, what was typed in. Huge amounts of detail can be captured and analytics about that. Do you want to capture all of that? That is a valid question. We've already seen, I think someone made a Freedom of Information Act request against a government minister in the UK, asking what were the prompts, what were their prompts using ChatGPT in relation to some legislation, and they actually did answer the question. So fascinating to see how it could be used and used in litigation going forward.
Yes, yeah, interesting. Fantastic. Okay, let's go back to another question. I'm going to just for now skip the second question there and come back to that. That was around sort of forum, so I'll come back to that one. But the question there, let's say I use an AI model, ChatGPT, for example, to run simple structural design and calculations. Could ChatGPT claim intellectual property for the design or for generating architectural 3D renders of a new building? So it's again around intellectual property, and does that sit with the person who's using it or with the provider? Perhaps James, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, so completely computer generated design is slightly different under the Copyright Designs and Patents Act than if you are creating a design uniquely yourself. So there can be some grey areas there. I would just be very clear about what product and tool you're using. So ChatGPT, I'm aware, also OpenAI's ChatGPT, in its terms, makes clear that the outputs of what is created are owned by you if copyright exists in your local jurisdiction. So, and that applies to most of the major providers, most of the major enterprise providers, such as Copilot with Microsoft's Copilot. But you just need to make sure that's the case. So someone needs to have looked at the terms and conditions, the license terms, to make sure you own that in that particular case.
Yes, thank you. Peter, would you like to add anything there?
No, I wouldn't. James knows much more about IP than I do, but it's reassuring to know that ChatGPT isn't stealing our good work.
Well, what you don't necessarily know is that it isn't then trained. You might own the output, but you've given them a license to train the model. So the knowledge leaks out into the wider model. That's why it's really important to use the enterprise versions of these software, rather than just, if as it's always been said, if the product's free, you're the product.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I've heard of people's financial data or a case where somebody was using it for financial checks or assessment, and then that financial data was fed out to somebody else on the other side of the world from ChatGPT, because, as you say, data goes in and it can come out somewhere else unless you have that agreement in place.
Yeah.
Great. There's a question here around potentially humans not being in the loop. So I wonder about the impact of our deliverables being generated by AI, but then also a client reviewing and assessing our deliverables using AI. So ending up in a situation where you've got sort of AI generated and then being checked by AI. So I wonder, perhaps Peter, in terms of the roles, it's not just the designer or the constructor or contractors, but there's a sort of an onus or responsibility onto the client as well there as part of their role when reviewing or using AI.
Yeah, well, quite. I mean, two thoughts in relation to that, just sticking with the perspective of the professional. Firstly, when it comes to checking, I talked about some of the different scenarios that arise, but if you've got technology talking to each other in real time, how do you check that? How do you, in a timely way, check the interactions that are taking place? As we engage online with chatbots powered by artificial intelligence, how do the organizations who put them up there take due care around that when they can't possibly be involved in those interactions? And of course, the answer to that must come in the way in which those chatbots, those models are prepared and trained and reviewed and monitored between times. So if you like, it's the sort of paradigm example of how the preparation for the interaction is where the care has to be taken, because you can't take it when you're actually in the interaction itself. The other thing to say is, what does it mean to you as a professional if your client is not engaging with the advice that you're giving, or if they're engaging with it in a way that creates risk as to their understanding of it? How do you cope with that? And that must come both in terms of the advice that you give around those interactions, and possibly also in the designs that you produce. It does create particular challenges, I would suggest, to be locked into that scenario. And I would presume that that would be preceded by a conversation with the client about that method of working, and the risks that it creates.
Just a follow-on question to you, Peter, on that topic. Do you think, can liability for a failure of generative AI be excluded?
Very difficult, I would suggest. As I've said, ultimately the court will take the view that the buck stops with professionals, and the court is not going to accept an approach whereby a professional can abdicate responsibility to some sort of automated technology. So it's a difficult area. In many cases, particularly in a business-to-business context, that question will be governed by the Unfair Contract Terms Act. And in that context, an attempt to exclude or limit liability will be subject to the requirements of reasonableness. In other words, it won't be enforceable if it doesn't comply with that. And that's a reasonably open and textured test. The court will ask, well, what's fair and reasonable in the circumstances? And it will look at things like the bargaining position of the parties, the extent to which they've had legal advice. It will look at the availability of insurance to cover the risks in question. And it will look at the specific problems around AI and how those risks are best managed, I would suggest. So I would have thought any attempt to exclude all liability for anything done by AI technologies you're using, it is very unlikely to be an enforceable term. You probably have to think in much more nuanced terms about what limitations and restrictions could be possible. But I think people ought to be thinking about that. I think they ought to be thinking about it in particular in the context of consequential losses, particularly where they're using tools to perform volume exercises, and what they can negotiate to protect themselves against the worst category of risk.
Yes, okay. And perhaps sticking with that topic of contracts, James, perhaps a question for you. How do you think the standard forms of contracts like JCT or NEC will adapt to AI? Do you think there's bespoke drafting needed for those?
Yeah, I think in the short term, you're going to get quite a lot of bespoke drafting, which no one really wants when you're dealing with things like NEC. You really want NEC to stand on its own as an example, but JCT, NEC, any of the fitted contracts, any of those type of contracts, they are written though from a human-centric point of view at the moment, with traditional risk allocation, and it I think some of those issues will come up. They don't necessarily deal with they deal with IP in a certain way, but not about the outputs and underlying models. Validation and safety, it doesn't have those kind of models built into it. I think what we'll see relatively rapidly is some kind of standard forms catching up with things like AI schedules or guidance notes to go with them. I think for the time being, sort of bespoke drafting is probably the safest option, but we are seeing the industry catching up, and we're already dealing with quite a lot of those kind of standard AI amendments to NEC contracts at the moment. But then that takes you away from being a standard contract and makes it rather less practical for everyone.
Yes, thank you. That's useful guidance. Looking through the questions, there's been one around what sectors would be most affected, but I think for that we'll perhaps put a link, or ask our Syria team to put a link into the RICS survey, because I think that was useful in capturing a sort of a broader industry view on what sectors might be affected. I wonder, we've got sort of a minute left or so. There was a question around what sort of forums or how could people hear more about this topic and how to understand more about the responsible use of AI within their organizations. Perhaps you both just give a kind of indication of where you would point people to, or what guidance people might look at in terms of how to start that journey or make sure they're using it responsibly.
If I can quickly kick off, I just think look at professional bodies, look at organisations like Syria, look at iStructD, CIBSE, RIBA, all the construction related bodies and bodies in the built environment are talking about this at the moment. It's probably one of the largest topics. Keep an eye on legislation, keep an eye on any relevant case law. I think it requires quite a lot of reading and following the news. Peter.
Yeah, totally agree with that. The only thing I would add is look at the US. I think the discussion there is a little bit more advanced. I think some of the larger consultancies there are really heavily investing. And I think there's some lessons to be learned already from what's happening over there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to Peter and James. So mindful of time, 12:30. It's the end of that panel discussion. So I'll briefly summarize some of the key messages, and then we've got a couple of slides just to run through a couple of final points. So I think we've heard brilliantly from Peter. He's talked about how we can discharge a duty of care using AI. A conclusion that generative AI won't change the law necessarily on negligence claims, unlikely to reduce the standard of care, and actually may even elevate in some cases the standard of care depending on the advice that's given, and emphasizing a key scrutiny would be on the selection of the tools used and the adoption of the technology. We've heard from James on the 5 pathways to liability. He's talked us through the data and privacy aspects and used some examples of fines where people have actually had claims against them for the misuse of data. Intellectual property and a warning against sort of over-promising what AI might be able to do, and again leading to fines and claims around that topic. The contract and the risk element and the danger of AI introducing blind spots to contracts that will focus more around human-centric interactions. Safety and liability being one of the really key topics that came out in the survey and in the discussion from both of the panelists there. Decisions based on AI and risks, particularly in construction, where there is this safety implication. It's not just a kind of financial risk we're talking about, but it's people's lives as well, that obviously carries a greater standard of care, and is given some really helpful practical steps on how people can take forward AI in organizations and looking at the governance side and policies. So I'll say a huge thank you to everyone who's joined today's webinar. And a big thank you to James and to Peter for your valuable contributions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just follow on the next couple of slides. So we'll endeavour to respond to any questions that we haven't covered today. So if you do have any additional questions for speakers, please contact the Syria team. We still can pass those on and deal with those questions. We're keen to hear from your experience of the webinar. So if you please complete the online poll that's just popped up, hopefully for you. That'll influence how we do these forwards and make sure they're most useful to you as the audience. And upcoming events, please register now for the Nature for Health and Wellbeing in Prison Environments webinar. So that's due to be upcoming on the 9th of December. And if you'd like to hear more about AI in this topic, please register for the next Syria debate on AI in construction, embrace or avoid, that's taking place in April next year. And I think from us, that's everything. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you for your questions. That's all for now. Thank you. Goodbye.